Never underestimate the power of the people when they understand the message. Never underestimate that. I think that this is something that can be done quite quickly. I think it's something that can be done rather efficiently. It's just going to require a large enough parade. It's going to require a large enough people to understand the core concepts. And that's the real work that we have to do right now, is hit that critical tipping point, which is probably around 20 or 30% of the voting populace actually understanding the issue.
And a big part of the issue when creating a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy movement is an understanding of how race and racism were constructed in the United States through law, and how those laws informed our culture in much the same way those corporate rights have been constructed through the law to ensure rule of the wealthy minority over the majority, and how our culture reinforces and legitimizes that lack of democracy. Right from the very beginning, Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution defined people as property. You see, the authors of the Constitution were very interested in protecting their property, including slaves. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. Indigenous communities are forced from their homelands. Over 10 years, 100,000 native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown arid territory. 15,000 do not survive the journey. But over 25 million acres of land is made available for white settlers. 1854, the People versus Hall. Non-whites are barred from testifying in court. No black, mulatto, or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Free blacks are taxed, but still have no rights of citizenship granted to whites. 1862, Emancipation Proclamation in District of Columbia. Slaves are freed in D.C., but former slave owners are reimbursed for slaves given up. Whites are paid over $1 million in reparations for lost property. 1862, Homestead Act. 50 million acres of formerly indigenous land in the West, having been violently invaded by U.S. soldiers in violation of treaties, is distributed by the government at low cost to white settlers only. And 100 million acres of indigenous land are given for free to railroad developers. 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act bans immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. 1924, Johnson-Reed Act creates an immigration quota system based on national origin, favoring Nordics over the inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe. 1934, in the wake of the Great Depression, the National Housing Act is implemented, creating a federal housing authority to provide loans and federal subsidies for home ownership, but the FHA mortgage underwriting standards discriminate against non-whites and investment in non-white communities through a process called redlining. 1942, an executive order forces 111,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps. And the war on drugs declared by Richard Nixon violently targets and imprisons people of color disproportionately through today.
Righteous anger can only be provoked by anger at injustice or unfairness. And I'm angry about the fact that we've got 20 to 25% of the children in the richest country in the world who go to bed hungry or undernourished every night. I'm angry about the fact that we have transnational corporations that are destroying the planet that we depend upon for life itself. And I'm angry about the fact that the world that's being created with the rape and plunder of Mother Earth is a racist, sexist, and class-oppressive society. You bet I'm angry. I'm angry because it doesn't have to be this way.
Are we in a class war right now?
Of course we are. And you know, Warren Buffett, I think, said it the clearest. He said, we're in a class war, and we've been in a class war for years, and my class is winning. And who is his class? The owning class, the people who own these corporations.
We could solve all the problems of the Western world. But we don't want to know how you got down there. No, that's why we came up with that bumper sticker. Stuff happens. That's the G-rated version. That's a bumper sticker that only a straight white upper middle class male could have made. Because anyone who isn't straight, anyone who isn't male, anyone who isn't white, anyone who isn't upper middle class knows that stuff doesn't just happen. Stuff gets done by people to people. Nothing is a coincidence. Nothing is random. It isn't osmosis. And so we act as if it's some passive thing, but yet that's not the case. And the second problem with the term underprivileged is even bigger than the first one, is it's a relative term. Again, this is grammar. Man, you don't like this, you can disagree with anything else I say tonight. If you have a problem with this piece right here, you must take it up with your third grade grammar teacher, because it is not on me. If we use the word underprivileged, then by definition there must be an overprivileged, but we don't use that word in polite conversation. Indeed, it doesn't exist in any dictionary to be found on the planet. If you don't believe me, go back to your res hall, go back to your apartment, go back to your home, go back to your place of employment. And tomorrow I want you to punch in two little words. The first one, underprivileged. Make no mistake, your spell check is going to recognize that word. It's in their dictionary. They can give you the definition. They can give you the synonym. They can give you the antonym. They can show you the phonetic way in which you should spell it. Now come down one line, type in the word overprivileged, and watch how fast that little red line pops up. That line which says, nope, you're an idiot. Making up words that don't exist. Try again and get back to us. But if there's an underprivileged, there must be an overprivileged. Why don't we talk about it? Because that would require that we acknowledge that if there are 2 to 3 million people being targeted for race-based housing discrimination because they are people of color every year, that is 2 to 3 million more places I can live. If people of color are being targeted and profiled and I'm not, that is an advantage. It may or may not have material consequences. A lot of privilege isn't about material acquisition, so please know this. When I talk about white privilege, I don't even mean money necessarily. For some, it definitely translates to that. For some, it has certainly meant that. But even for those white folks who don't have that money, white privilege is real at the psychological level. I grew up for the first 18 years of my life in an 850 square foot apartment where the plumbing was always leaking, the air conditioning was constantly busted, we had no savings, we ran cars into the ground until they just stopped running, took no vacations, had no assets, had no credit that wasn't bad credit. So I was one of those white folks who certainly didn't have class privilege, and yet I had the knowledge that I was perceived in school as highly capable, not because of my class background, which was no great shakes, but because I was seen as a bright, capable white child, and students of color who were every bit as capable as I were tracked low while I was tracked high. I could make bad grades, and I never seemed to fall out of favor in those types of classes because I was seen as simply underperforming, not quite living up to my standards, you know. So I received the psychological edge of knowing that in those classrooms, if I didn't do well, and I often didn't, I was a bad student. But if I didn't do well, I never had to worry that that would be ascribed to my race. I never had to worry that someone would say, well, of course he's not good at that because, you know, he's white. Because unless I was going to be trying out for a job that involved jumping or dancing, what stereotype exactly is working against me as a white person? There aren't many. But for people of color, it's a whole different ball game. Knowing that if they underperform in an academic environment, knowing that if they end a sentence with a preposition when they answer that question in class, or if they mispronounce a word, or if they simply answer the question wrong, they have to wonder whether they dropped the ball not just for themselves, but for all those coming after them who look like them, whose presence on that campus or in that job complex, in that office, is constantly under scrutiny, constantly being questioned, constantly being double guessed, second and third and fourth guessed. Do they really belong here? That's what it means to be white, is never having to worry that you're going to trigger a series of negative stereotypes about your group, and if you're not able to overcome them, your opportunities will be limited. Yes, white women will face that on a gender level, but on a racial level, those who are white will never have to worry that their missteps, that our missteps will be attributed to our racial defect of some sort. And the research is very clear that that privilege, having one less thing to worry about, having one less thing to sweat in the classroom, trying to get the loan at the bank, at the job, or whatever the case might be, that has significant dividends. Because to have one less thing to sweat in a competitive society is the thing that separates oftentimes success from failure, or big success from medium success from smaller success. And the research is very clear that on an academic environment in particular, those persons who are constantly having to worry about whether or not their performance is going to trigger that negative group stereotype, that the mere anxiety caused by worrying about that is enough to drive down academic performance on standardized tests and in classroom performance, even when they are equally or better qualified than their counterparts who don't have to think about that. So it's a huge advantage to have that one less thing to concern oneself with, to not have the burden of representation, to not have to, in the parlance of the modern era, hold it down for white people. Because we as white folks know we don't have to do that. We also know that what other white people do won't stick to us. We have 19 men who happen to be Arab and Muslim who fly planes into buildings, and we have otherwise rational human beings running around insisting that we should stop and search everyone like them at the airport. We did not do this or anything even remotely like it when Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols brought down the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, nor would we have. We didn't do it when the Unabomber, crazy-ass white man in the woods of Montana, blowing people up for 20 years before they caught him. It didn't stick to the rest of us who were white men. The Olympic Park bomber, Eric Rudolph, puts a bomb in Olympic Village in Atlanta in '96, blows up a gay bar, blows up a family planning clinic. He too then runs off to the woods. As a side note, I have no idea what it is about white people and the woods. But whatever it is, probably explains why black folks don't do a lot of camping. So it doesn't stick to us. There have been over 125 family planning centers, some of which provide abortion services, many of which do not, that have been bombed or burned in the last 20 years. And every single one of them, according to the FBI, have been white. They've mostly been men. They claim to be Christian. Different lecture for a different night. 125 or more. 125 plus McVeigh and Nichols is 127. Unabomber's 128. Eric Rudolph is 129. 129 confirmed terrorists who are white in this country in the last 20 years. It sticks to nobody who's white. 19 Arab Muslims, and it sticks to everyone who is either 700 million Arab folk on the planet, 1.5 billion Muslims on the planet. To assume that we know something about them based on the acts of 19 is to commit what any statistician will tell you is sampling error. It is mathematical illiteracy. And yet we do it because we can. Privilege, not having to worry about it. But let me suggest to you something, because the title of this talk, after all, is The Pathology of Privilege. And I want to be very clear that privilege of not thinking about it, that privilege of not having to know someone else's reality, that privilege of being able to ignore it, and the privilege of benefiting from the inequality, having a certain leg up, actually is very dangerous. And not just for those who don't have it, that there is actually a downside for those who do. And this is important, right, because in a country like ours, which encourages us to take advantage of our advantages, if I tell you that you have privilege, your first inclination is not to try to get rid of that. That's not the culture in which we live. But I want to suggest to you there are reasons why even those of us who benefit in relative terms from racism and institutional white supremacy should care about this, not out of some altruistic, I want to help other people impulse, but because it is actually dangerous for us as well. Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick, and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and Lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured, like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land. Not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land. Just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock cleaned. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the west. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly. But back then they had no shame, so they didn't try and cover it up. They openly said it, but once again, the rich didn't want to go do the work. Are you kidding? No. They're going to get poor people to go fight for them. And the poor folks didn't even own slaves. Now think, how do you get poor people who don't even own the shirt on their back, let alone slaves, to go fight to keep your slaves for you? You've got to convince them that their skin is more important than their economic interest. Because think about it, if I am a farmer who has to charge you $1 a day or $2 a week to work on your farm and harvest that tobacco or pick that cotton, but you can get a black person to do it for free because you own them, who's going to get the job? Not me. In other words, slavery actually undermined the wages and the wage base, the economic floor of the typical white working class or low-income person. But they were told, if these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. And so at some level, again, working class white people being harmed by white privilege, relatively being advantaged, right? Being given a leg up, being given a membership to the club, but in absolute terms being kept economically subordinated by the very thing that gave them a sense of superiority. How's that for irony? Then in the present era, this hasn't stopped. This is not ancient history. Now we have people running around insisting that we should close the border with Mexico because if we don't, the wages of working class people will continue to fall. The implication being that the only reason workers are paid like crap in this country is because the border is open. But if you believe that, you would actually have to believe that if that border were closed, that all these owners of capital and industry would just say, oh, well, you figured us out. Here, it's a raise. Do we really believe that the only thing keeping bosses from paying people more is the presence of low-wage, medium, semi-skilled labor from south of this artificial border? Is that really what we believe? We know that if that border is closed, it isn't going to be closed to capital. It isn't going to be closed to goods. If you have a border that can be crossed by capital looking for the highest return on investment, or goods looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin, how is that going to work to the benefit of working people? By definition, it doesn't. By definition, it immiserates the working class. Divide and conquer. But the best example of all, perhaps, in the contemporary era, in the greater New Orleans area after Katrina. Here you have two communities that were the most hard hit. The lower Ninth Ward, mostly black community, 94% African American, about 40% official poverty rate, heavy working class community. And right across the canal, St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, 95% white, also working class, high levels of poverty, economically very similar. And at the end of the day, in those first few days of September 2005, more similar than they probably would have realized. Because when those levees broke, they all got their stuff jacked. They all got their stuff destroyed. But if you had asked white folks in Chalmette, and I've done it, who was the cause of the problems in the greater New Orleans area prior to that flooding, they would have pointed across that canal at those black folks, wouldn't have called them black folks, and would have said, there, that's the problem. 70% of the white folks in St. Bernard Parish voted for David Duke, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States when he ran for governor in 1991. 7 out of 10 gladly voted for him because he was blaming black folks for all of their problems, and they bought it. What's the irony? The irony is that while they were blaming black people for their problems, while they were blaming black people for the conditions of the greater New Orleans area in which they lived, nobody was paying attention, least of all they, to the fact that these white elite politicians, either in Baton Rouge or in Washington, whose job it was to secure those levees, to make sure that levy funds were spent in the proper way and that they were spent at all, those mostly white and mostly elite politicians did nothing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just the black folks in the lower Ninth Ward they didn't care about. They really couldn't have given a rat's ass about those poor and working class white folks either. And yet, when the people of Chalmette, people of St. Bernard Parish got back into session, first time they had a city council meeting, parish council meeting after the flooding, the lights aren't even on yet. The water isn't even hooked up. And the first order of business was to pass an ordinance saying that you couldn't rent property in St. Bernard Parish to anyone who wasn't a blood relative. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination as to why you'd want to pass a law. That law had never existed before. But now that it's been emptied out and you don't know who might come back, that's a damn good way to keep black people out, isn't it? Because if you're 95% white to begin with, if you pass an ordinance that says that, that's a great, you can't say no blacks need apply. You can't say no blacks allowed, but that was an ingenious way to get around the law. Now, they got caught. There was a lawsuit threatening, they got rid of the ordinance. But my point in bringing it up is to say, once again, divide and conquer is working. These white folks in Chalmette need to march across that canal and join hands with the black folks who've been sitting there more than willing to work with them for an awful long time, and march on Baton Rouge and march on DC and march on the Corps of Engineers and recognize their commonality of interest. But the whiteness and the lure of whiteness has tricked these have nothing in their bank account white people into believing that they got more in common with the rich white folks on St. Charles Avenue that didn't lose anything in that flooding than they have in common with the black working class folks who live about 500 yards away. That's what white privilege does to white folks, but that's not all. It also creates an intense anxiety, like a mental dysfunction, an emotional anxiety and distress. If you're privileged, after all, if you're the top dog, if you have all the advantage, you're constantly afraid of who's gaining on you. You're constantly afraid of who's coming to take what you have. We've got to close the border. They're coming to take our stuff. We got to worry about terrorists. They're coming to take our stuff. We got to get them before they get us. Preventative war. We got to stop them. That's what privilege will do for you, because those who have it are constantly anxious. A study in June of 2004 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which received very little attention, found that in the United States, the rates of anxiety disorder, depression, and substance abuse-related mental disorders are twice the global average, 5 times the rate in Nigeria. How is it that the most powerful and privileged people on earth can have so much more anxiety than people who live in war-torn areas. Civil war, political corruption, amazing problems, often famine, all kinds of hardships that for the most part we don't see, at least in the same abundance, let's say, in the United States, and yet it's here. That the greatest level of anxiety, I would suggest that the reason that happens is because it's the privilege that generates the anxiety. It's that constant fear of keeping up and staying ahead that generates the anxiety, the mentality of entitlement. The mentality that says, this is our world and we get to make the rules in this world, and then we come to find out not so much. And we don't deal with setback very well, those who are the dominant group. And then when the real world intrudes on us, it's like a psychological come apart, like a meltdown. So when those people in Littleton, Colorado had their school shot up at Columbine, or when the folks in Santee, California, Santana High School, Springfield, Oregon, Thurston High School, all of those nice white spaces, which from the mid-90s to the early 2000s seemed like at least once or twice a year there was another one of these mass school shootings, and almost every single one of them committed by a white male of upper middle class background in a place where everyone said this wasn't supposed to happen here. Because privilege allowed them to let down their guard to the dysfunction and pathology that they thought only existed over there. So we don't notice that Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris are building 35 bombs in the basement. Because privilege means I don't even have to know what my kids are doing. I ain't seen them in like a week. I'm taking classes at Home Depot. No kids of color could have gotten away with that. 35 bombs in what basement? A. B, if folks of color roll up to the Ace Hardware looking for bomb supplies, they are not going to be sold them. But these white middle-class folks drive up in nice cars looking to get some pipe bomb material, some explosives, some real short fuses, and it's for a science fair experiment. Sure, here, you know. All right, privilege. Usually it works out pretty well. 364 days out of the year, it goes okay. But if day 365 is April 20th of 1999 and your kid goes to Columbine High School, you really don't care much about the other 364. Because when you have that privilege of living in that bubble and you don't have to think about what you don't have to think about, remember, there may come a time when you have to think about it.